Hello and welcome to Finding Your Holy Grail, a show produced through Passionate World Talk Radio, whose goal is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. We would like to thank station manager Jeannie White and CEO Lillian Caldwell. I am your host, Dr. Mandy Simon, and I am joined by my co-creator, Dr. Gordon MacMillan. Welcome, Dr. MacMillan.
Thank you, Mandy. We're really happy to be taking forward the conversation from last week and serve our listeners by starting off 2021 with practical guidance on setting goals that can actually be achieved. This is our focus throughout January as we continue to build skills on living fearlessly in the post-pandemic world.
It is great to be stepping finally into 2021, especially with our listeners. And I sincerely wish the coming year brings security, good fortune, and good health to all members of our community, and most especially lots of human connection. Okay, so we are in our second week focusing on goals for the year 2021. For our listeners who joined us last week, we mentioned that goals that we can actually achieve are very different than goals that we set. So we're unpacking the perceptions of fear, our level of resilience, our own belief systems, to have greater awareness over how we identify our blind spots, and with a very special week on muscle testing so that we can achieve every goal we set for our lives. The plan is to use all the knowledge we learned together this month to make sure the goals that we wrote down on January 1st are the goals that we can actually achieve, as opposed to the goals that we think we can achieve. This will ensure we manifest the future we choose. So this week, our focus is on resilience.
And I love this aspect of defining and working towards our own goals. When we are resilient, we know how to depend on ourselves, which means we can more easily and joyfully serve others.
It's true. And when we created this show, we spent the first 10 weeks creating content and speaking to experts to help our listeners do just that, become more resilient. So in today's show, we're quite excited to unpack the concept of resilience and provide a perspective on the importance of having daily practices that become habits so that living resiliently is second nature to each of us.
We're passionate about this subject, and we've looked into the most effective strategies for setting and achieving goals. So listen in and get excited, because understanding this will definitely change your life for the better. It's awesome when you master this process because, as Mandy explained last week, you're then able to move beyond simply surviving on the treadmill of life to thrive and grow by realizing your dreams.
Right. So we're not just prioritizing and being practical about our objectives for the year ahead. We're actually approaching the whole exercise of goal setting from an entirely new perspective. And this requires us to think through the mechanics of ensuring our aspirations become a reality. And we will learn today that when we are resilient, we can live more joyful and more fulfilled lives during times even of uncertainty. And what we all know firsthand is that these times are the most uncertain many of us have ever experienced.
As I understand it, uncertainty is not actually a problem in itself if a person does not let that uncertainty unravel their lives to such an extent they become ruled by fear. For example, some people are less affected by uncertainty than others. We all know some individuals that land on their feet time and time again, regardless if they had a job loss, loss of money, break in a relationship, you name it. They seem to always survive like superheroes. And we also can think of the individuals who seem to completely unravel in similar situations and never regain their footing.
You've got it. And this is where resilience comes into the mix. The stress response from the fear a person perceives is usually tempered by their levels of resilience. So the more resilient they are as a person, the easier they can manage the potential negative outcomes of a stress response caused by the fear stimulus. And for those listeners who want to get literal, resilience is defined as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. And you can figuratively think of this as the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, such as elasticity. Resilience is an attribute of a person's character that is often influenced by how much emotional and or financial support, as well as the ability of their basic needs to be met from a young age in life. In truth, it's different for all of us. But depending on how emotionally or physically healthy we feel at the time we are dealing with a situation will depend how resilient we are or how quickly we bounce back. This is also dependent on our level of resilient skills. The important point is that we can never realize our goals if we're not resilient in life. And this is because continually we get knocked off course while we're working toward our goals.
It's true. If we let our attention, energies, and resources get diverted by other people's agendas as we navigate the practical realities of life, we will always fall short of meeting our goals. Do you have any examples for our listeners?
My favorite example is the need for boundaries. I practice resilience daily by setting both strong energetic boundaries, so the unseen, and tangible, the seen boundaries. And we actually spent episode 12 focusing on our need for boundaries. Simply put, if you haven't set the expectation with others in your life about how they can treat you and interact with you, realizing your goals and creating the life you choose is going to be next to impossible. Think about it. If you always want to say no to someone, but you say yes to them, how often will you get to the point in your life that you're trying to get to? So practicing and setting firm boundaries in your life is one of the greatest resilience practices a person can do.
In fact, the great news is that all resilience issues are skills which we can develop ourselves, and we can fill our arsenal with lots of resilience practices. Over time, we can become more aware of how we're affected by certain situations, either positively or negatively, and we can learn techniques to become more resilient. And these help us to manage stress more effectively.
Exactly. And the truth is, like everything, and as we mentioned before, we're all a little bit different. So some of us are naturally more resilient in one area than we will be in another. But if we're consistent about our resilience practices, we naturally become less fearful as we learn to handle more stressors with greater ease. So one of the most important things to adopt is positive self-care practice activities in our lives. And we hear this all the time. Eat a good diet, have good exercise habits, create the ability to live life with integrity by accepting personal responsibility for our own actions, not blaming others for our own problems, our ability to experience love and joy, the ability to give love, to practice gratitude. The list is quite extensive and essential to the resilience that we acquire.
Indeed, as our listeners may recall, these techniques to build resilience are so important that our previous broadcasts explored each one in turn.
Yes. And this is where I want to share with the listeners that when we created this podcast, I specifically invited several experts I've worked with before. These are really amazing individuals that I collaborated with during the initial lockdown of the COVID pandemic. I felt they had some valuable tools to help our listeners move forward in developing their resilience practices. And I'm really grateful to each of them for their time to share in their wisdom and expertise with us.
Yeah, I remember we chose to lead off episode 2 with Sandy Ash and have listeners list the 30 gifts that COVID gave them. The first time I tried to make this list back in May 2020, I struggled to write down more than 10 items. But in October, when I revisited the list, I felt quite renewed. I actually was able to list 25 items. So I guess something had really shifted for me.
I think you've made such an important observation. You did have a shift, and it is one of the biggest factors in our ability to become more resilient, and it's called perception. It is our perception of a situation which determines if we can successfully do something or if we fall short of our intended mark. Does this resonate with you at all?
Absolutely. In fact, I feel really grateful for this change in perspective. I know you're right. My shift was because I was able to have some success along the way, and this changed my perception. I moved from feeling isolated in lockdown to really being grateful for the time I had with my parents, for example.
It is interesting how many times just now you refer to gratitude. And I guess that's why in episode 4, we invited Steve Foran to come back and talk to us about having a daily gratitude practice. I love Steve's perspective. He tells me the only thing, quote unquote, he does in his business is focus on gratitude. In fact, he teaches individuals and companies the importance of writing down 3 gratitudes a day. For those of you who have seen the show, you'll remember this. And I have to admit for myself, it's a powerful practice because I started consistently writing down 3 gratitudes a day. I can now see how many things, people, and experiences I am thankful for. And this prompted me to share my gratitude about them with them. And this has actually helped me to improve my bonds of affection and friendships during these times of what I call social isolation and physical distancing. This simple practice of writing down 3 gratitudes a day has absolutely made me a more resilient person. Steve's work has helped me in some situations move from a place of fear to a positive emotional state. And it's certainly more than once, and sometimes multiple times in a day. It's an amazing resilience practice.
I really like that we're helping our listeners to understand the role of perception in our ability to be resilient. And I recall watching your segment with emotional intelligence expert Sylvia Baffor in episode 8. Sylvia talked to our listeners about how to navigate uncertainty by paying close attention to their thoughts. She suggested replacing barricading questions with gateway questions. For example, instead of boxing ourselves in by asking why we did this, why did this thing happen to me, we can create a world of opportunity by asking, well, what can I do about it? Or how might I improve my situation?
It's really true. Every single person on this planet benefits when they can look at a situation and approach it from a position of opportunity rather than victimhood. This happens when we ask, how can I? That creates opportunity rather than asking, why did this happen to me? Which creates victimhood. And in fact, during this episode, some of you might remember that Sylvia put me in the position of the victim and her in the position of opportunity. And I actually could feel it emotionally when she gave that role to me and assigned it to me. It was a really interesting dynamic. So the examples are endless in terms of ways that each of us can build resilience. And for our listeners at home, if you're looking for new practices or assistance on creating better practices for building your resilience, definitely check out episodes 2 through 12. There's a lot of great information with some really fine experts.
That's really nice, Mandy. And I'd like to share with our listeners how your interview with Dr. Welsh was changing life for me. The two of you really unpacked the importance of recognizing that we always have some control over how we respond to unforeseen circumstances. As human beings, we are creative dreamers, and through tapping into our core values, we can all draw on our personal sovereignty to build resilience.
I really enjoyed this discussion with Matt Welsh, and I really enjoyed it just from my own perspective of this fact that I consistently tell my patients and my students, and my clients, my friends, and even myself that the only real control we have in life is over our reaction to a situation. And I think when we truly internalize this, it gives us a level of resilience that is irreplaceable. And so I think that brings us to our natural stopping point this week, because next week we are going to discuss the importance of our belief systems. And our personal sovereignty is very dependent on our belief systems. It's amazing how many factors contribute to our ability to actually achieve the goals that we set in life. I'm so happy to be able to discuss in the new year and have something that will really help all of us move forward to a much brighter and better 2021.
No, surely 2022, I think. And before we go, let me take our listeners back to the beginning of our discussion today. It's pretty easy to define goals for the coming year, but as we mentioned last week, the tricky bit is how we make our dreams come true. But it doesn't have to be this way. And that is why during the month of January, we're looking into the role of fear, resilience, belief systems, and blind spots. We want you to live your best life and make 2021 your best year ever, regardless if we are in the middle of a pandemic. We're going to set you up so that you can achieve every goal that you set your mind on.
Yes, and I hope our listeners wrote down their goals on January 1st, just like all the years before. But I'm also going to make sure and ask that everybody does their homework, which is the call to action, so that we can be ready at the end of the month to modify any of the resolutions that we wrote down on January 1st based on the information that we learn over these weeks in January. So this week's challenge for each of you at home is to 1, list your most resilient characteristics and practices. How are you able to bounce back from adverse circumstances in life? 2, list 5 ways, at the very least, that you could become more resilient. And 3, consider how you can incorporate more resilient practices into your everyday life.
Finally, we want to thank Passionate World Talk Radio for providing a platform on their internet radio station for our show, Finding Your Holy Grail. For more information, go to www.passionateworldtalkradio.com. To subscribe to our community, go to www.findingyourholygrail.com. And please write to us at findingyourholygrail@gmail.com.
Until next week, keep well and stay brave. Oh, and dive into the homework or your call to action and give yourself the gift of building resilience into your life. It's one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself and your loved ones. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in with us this week. And I really look forward to you joining the conversation next week when we tackle belief systems.